Success Factors. So, my name is Richard Harbridge. I work for a company called All In Consulting in Massachusetts. What we do is a lot of different SharePoint work, from sort of front-end development all the way back through to back-end integration with a lot of different systems, upgrade, etc. But one of the important aspects of working for a company like this is that I work with lots of different types of clients. And so you're introduced to different cultures, different environments, and a lot of different people challenges and non-technical challenges in those environments. And what I'm going to talk to today are things that I use in practice at my work with All In. SharePoint, I've been working with it for a number of years, and I really love the SharePoint community as well. So this webinar is for anyone to view, but if you found what I describe in this webinar as useful, please pass the message along. Nothing here is proprietary. It's free for everyone to consume, because what we really want to do is sort of encourage this thought process a little bit more towards the people or non-technical factors of SharePoint and how you approach some of those things successfully. And then lastly, I have a bunch of certifications and things that allow me to at least understand the technology itself. So kind of on. Understanding the non-technical is necessary to avoid poor understanding, knowledge around limitations. And probably the big one that impacts SharePoint projects a lot is this estimation of effort. So a lot of times we look at SharePoint and we're like, I have no idea how we're going to build it. We have so many options. How do we estimate effort for those types of things? These are also the biggest reasons SharePoint projects fail. And all of these reasons, if you think about it, are non-technical in nature, right? Knowledge around limitations of the software is important, but that's almost maybe an instance of, should we use this software for this purpose or some other software? In the sense of maybe our corporate culture or the way that people work doesn't work with certain aspects of SharePoint, or maybe there's some clash, very private culture, etc. So we'll get into that in the presentation, but just set the right mood. And our goal today is to kind of come from this, I'm running around, I'm not really sure how to deal with a lot of these people challenges, a lot of these non-technical challenges when doing technology implementations, but specifically around SharePoint implementations, and create this sense of confidence, clarity, and direction. So moving on, the thing we're going to talk about is understanding the why and making a decision around SharePoint. So Joe is going to help us for the rest of this presentation. At a company, decision makers don't have enough information, the CFO needs to reduce costs, IT services struggles to keep up, and people are having trouble finding what they need. Right? This is a fairly common thing. You see this a lot. It's almost really the marketing material of Microsoft, right? So Joe has this idea. He said, since Microsoft is awesome and everyone else is not as awesome, right? Totally makes sense. Everyone in Joe's company uses Microsoft Office. SharePoint's the perfect fit. Right? Stop for a second and really think about that. Does that really make sense, right? So why I really want to highlight this is, I'm a business analyst by trade. That's what I love to do is kind of diagnose what the real problems are and then map solutions to them. But the reality is, here what we really have is Joe doesn't maybe really understand the needs of the organization. When we went through that, we went through all these high-level needs and problems, but we never really came up with, is SharePoint the right fit for it, or is SharePoint is it even a technology problem, right? Mapping the needs of the organization to the right technology is really key. And to that, often what you might do is perform in-depth product comparisons and evaluations, right? So what we do is say, okay, these are all our needs. Let's say we totally understand what the needs of the business are. We have all these problems. We know all our pain points. And so what we want to do is look at what are the products that might fill this space. There's obviously a lot more out there than just Microsoft SharePoint. What we might do is we might look at, this is an old one, but also comparisons and say, well, what does this product do and what does SharePoint do and how do they meet, right? Where's the middle ground? And of course, analyst reports exist as well, but I would encourage you to build your own simply because you never know what the different sort of leverage points analysts are looking at, whether it really appeals to your situation. So if you know your needs, that's a better way of approaching it. This is also important because Microsoft has quite a few technologies. This is one of the biggest problems in SharePoint projects. Initially started off very small. I'm going to pick a specific example here. So say you're in your organization and sales comes up to you and says, we love to manage all our contacts. And you say, okay, well, SharePoint has a contacts list in it, right? So we'll create a single, large contact list, and we'll allow salespeople to add contacts in there, and we can, set version history and all sorts of other cool things. And now what we have is this wonderful solution using SharePoint for sales main issue, which is how do we share contacts and work with contacts. It works with Outlook and stuff, right? Because we can, integrate that with Outlook by clicking Add to Outlook or Access as an Outlook. But the issue here is what they start doing is they say, well, instead of having contacts, can we add an extra column? And maybe that column just helps us decide what the contact type is. And you say, what do you mean by contact type? And they say, well, I have a lead, and then I have an opportunity, and then I eventually have an account. I don't want to denote which type of contact that is. And could I create maybe another list, and that's the list of the companies, and then associate those contacts with that company's list, and then have an account type? So you do all that, and everything's working great. And then eventually they come back to you and say, well, I'd really like to be able to add more information when they're an opportunity, specifically for those that are opportunities. And you're starting to see where this is going. It becomes more and more complicated very, very quickly. And in many situations, that might be good if SharePoint is the right fit. But what I'm describing right now is a core feature set of Microsoft Dynamics CRM, right? It's the ability to manage that sales funnel process. So what we have to do is know when to sort of draw the line. You've done this proof of concept or this prototype in SharePoint because it worked great for it. Now you understand what you need more. Let's look at one of these, solutions that are really designed for your problem, rather than building the hodgepodge things in SharePoint and then having to support them and creating a whole lot of stress and other issues inside the organization. So really what we're getting at here is we need to really understand the needs and then map them to the appropriate technology. Even if we said SharePoint has multiple options, right? SharePoint has online, on-premises, right? Office 365, etc. There's 2007, 2010, right? And 2007 is still a viable solution for some companies, simply because 2010 is newer, so there's not as much support material, or maybe because they've already initiated their 2007 project, etc. Actually, what version are we using in terms of licensing? Because obviously that changes the functionality that we have available out of the box and what we might have to customize or create ourselves. Lastly, and I mentioned this earlier, but I really want to get it across, it's not always just a feature-to-feature comparison. When we talk about these products, there's scenarios in an organization where your business need or your business problem can't be solved with technology, right? Examples of this, if there's problems with political nature, or if there's problems where some people are just not contributing to a process or not involved in a process, etc., SharePoint might not magically make that happen. Especially process type issues, you're going to start dealing with more and more people rather than just SharePoint itself. And since this is a collaboration tool, often what we're doing is we're dealing with a little bit less defined processes, and it becomes even more important to understand, does SharePoint work with the corporate culture and other types of scenarios like that. Joe does all this good research because he loves doing research, and he's done a great job. And he discovers that SharePoint is part of his overall enterprise technology plan. So that's the perfect fit on its own. It works with the other things that he's got in his enterprise. He's got SQL licensing already, maybe. He's got Exchange. He's got Office. And because he's Office, then it makes sense. And maybe there's other reasons that he might want to use SharePoint. But it's important to understand, how does SharePoint fit with the rest of your enterprise stack, whether it's SAP or whether it's some other system. The outcome of all this, what I'm really getting at, is within the overall enterprise, what we have to do is plan SharePoint to meet specific business needs. Sometimes it does happen that SharePoint is purchased sort of on an emotional decision. Someone sees it at a conference or something, and they say, we need SharePoint, and they create a development team or a team to execute it. The reality is, even in those situations, we want to look back at it and say, does this make sense? Have we really defined a real need? If we haven't, we need to do that. So there's never, too late time for that. What we'll watch out for is we have to define those needs carefully. Said that enough. Achieving buy-in and setting expectations. So we have a little bit of a fun exercise. Before we begin, I want to talk about perceptions. So I want to look at your monitors for a second if you're not already and you're just listening. And this is a picture, and I want you to just look at this picture and think in your head, what does this picture look like? Different interpretations of what this picture might look like. And some people, when I ask that question, especially in public, people, well, I see a landscape, right? So this is like the city, and here's like the lake or something where there's no lights. Some people see a person's face. Some people see a cow, which it actually is from a psychology perspective. And so what this really denotes is that people see different things, right? And I think everyone gets this, right? People have different perceptions. And what does this have to do with SharePoint? Well, they impact motivation. So this section is really about buy-in and motivation, right? Why would people care about SharePoint? We understand that people's interpretation of words, as an example, are very different. If I take the word attractiveness, that has different connotations to different people, right? Some people go, oh, it means this. Some people say, oh, it means this. And so when I take the word SharePoint, it has the same problem. When I say the word SharePoint to people, it creates different reactions. People have different interpretations of what it means. I've had people tell me it's a browser, believe it or not. So there's lots of bad knowledge out there and good knowledge, and what we want to do is avoid the word SharePoint and use different terms like intranet or employee file management solution or whatever its purpose is, describe it that way or describe it by a brand name that you're creating to keep things consistent. But typically don't call SharePoint because it's a bad idea, then people get very confused, specifically if it's your intranet or something like that. So two groups must buy in and have the right expectations for SharePoint to be successful: IT services and the decision makers in an organization. The most important thing to IT services. So in your head, just think about it for a second. If you're in IT, what is the most important thing to you? If you work with IT, what is the most important thing to them? Thinking maybe cost, maybe the ability to respond to things quickly. There's a lot of different answers to this question, right? What I'm going to choose from my perspective, the most important thing to IT is cost of ownership. Specifically, they want to decrease the cost of ownership. Why do they do that? Because it's very costly for them to manage everything and depend on everything, and it's better for the business if the business can execute with IT performing well. So one ways we can convince IT services that SharePoint actually helps with cost of ownership, right? Well, the big point that I'm going to share is that, and this is a key one, SharePoint eventually allows business users to build or develop their solutions without IT's direct involvement. Right? And this is the same thing that you might do with Excel, right? If I have I'm a business user and I have a problem, I might build a solution in Excel. And the same reason I might use Access, the direct access, or I might use SharePoint. But that is actually the encouraged thing. That's what a good SharePoint implementation really has as like its final tenet, is that it needs to help business users get their jobs done and build their solutions without IT always having to be involved, because otherwise that means cost of ownership keeps increasing for IT and it starts to bog down the system and IT becomes a bottleneck. Difficult because IT organizations might want that control, and this is not typical, but we need to make sure that they understand that that's really the way that SharePoint is designed. So you're going to have, that's why it's successful in the marketplace, and that's something they need to keep in mind. IT doesn't want to support or learn a new technology. SharePoint's integration is invaluable, right? So we want to talk to that. And lastly, it's great for like this way of building applications. So let's talk about that. Doesn't want to support a new technology, and I'm going to do it by using a sort of a quick story, right? We have information overload. This is a real concept. We have information in our organization, and we have a number of systems that support that information. So typically in organizations, we have search, we have collaboration, we have management. They already have systems that do this in most cases, right? Whether it's a manual one or a technology one. And so what's happening is information starts to grow, like always, and some of these systems start to have problems. At this point, maybe what we realize is control or our permissions are becoming an issue. Some documents and items in our organization are no longer sort of secure in the way that they should be. So what does IT do? It focuses in on this control area at the bottom left corner of this. They focus on that little circle and they build a better solution for that. And when we're building that better solution, information doesn't stop growing. Well, at this point, we've finished that project on control. Control is no problem. Security-wise, everything's set up right, etc. But now people can't find what they're looking for because search is an issue, right? And so then IT starts looking at search independently, and then they get overwhelmed. This is the typical model of information overload, and specifically the cost of ownership issues in IT. So this tells them, yes, I get your problem. This is a problem. SharePoint is not an extra one of these circles, which is one of the interpretations a lot of them have. Instead, it's a platform. What does it really mean? It says this model doesn't work. Right? We've seen this model again and again and again, and we know it doesn't work. It's too costly. It doesn't work in the long run. It becomes legacy very quickly. So Microsoft said, this model is not working. Let's throw it away. Let's create a platform architecture where all these things, these services, are interconnected. Right? And in this context, if we have control issues, if we have permission issues in SharePoint, when I adjust permissions, it automatically changes the search results, right? There's a thing called security trimming. So what you see is what you get. So what you have permissions to is what you get. So if I change permissions on a document and say you can't see it anymore, when you do a search, immediately you're not going to be able to see it. And that's because it's all integrated. It's a single platform to work from. So this is the benefit of a platform, and it actually decreases the cost of ownership, and it's something that you invest in. It's something that you just purchase. So yes, buy SharePoint, but when we buy it, it's really an investment for us to build off of and for us to continue to manage in this sort of interconnected services. And this works really well for when we start talking about SharePoint 2010, since each of these is often a service on its own. Most important thing to decision makers, right? We talked about IT and IT services. When I say decision makers, again, I've used an ambiguous name. That could be executives, that could be STEAM teams, that could be managers and directors, that could be just, people at the end of the day who have to use SharePoint, right? We want to tell them that it adds value, not only to them, but it adds value to the business, right? That's the main point I want to get across with this next little bit around decision making. So what do I really mean by that? The biggest point is really that it helps them achieve their business objectives. So you have a number of objectives in the business, things that you need to meet by quarter or by year or goals of the business. We want to prove, that SharePoint is going to help achieve those things in a better, manner, whether it's productivity gains, whether it's actually able to execute that since we're building it inside of SharePoint, whatever it happens to be, but we have to really be able to prove that. But the reality is these are the tricky parts. These objectives are often not specific enough. So, as an organization, we use these platitudinal statements. We want to enhance collaboration, right? That's not a specific objective, so we need to break that down. And then it takes time and investment. Everyone kind of wants that solution to the thing that they're thinking about, which is a problem, but they haven't really documented or clarified what their problem is, right? And this isn't obviously just executives. I'm kind of picking on them, but it's certainly a difficult issue. First step in this, for any SharePoint initiative or implementation to be successful, we have to prioritize and plan our objectives of that. So I'm talking about a general SharePoint implementation. I'm going to tell you, we want to centralize knowledge and resources. We want to enhance collaboration. Well, what do any of those things mean? When they say automate and improve business processes, what does that really mean? Do they mean paper-based processes? Okay, you want to get rid of your paper-based processes. Which ones? HR ones. Which HR ones? Employee file management ones, absence management, onboarding. Now we're specific enough where we can actually, we're starting to think of solutions for each of these. When we get to that level, what we start saying to them is, okay, this is measurable. We can tell you when we've achieved this, right? We have an HR employee file management system, and it's not paper-based. We've achieved automating and improving business processes, right? Obviously, the better that solution is, the closer we are to a better success criteria, but the reality is you can start to do that. So this is really important. If you don't have a clear plan for what you want to do with SharePoint, or even on a single SharePoint initiative, if you don't break it down and figure out what is your success criteria, then it's very difficult to measure whether or not you're actually implementing it successfully. Another here, I have these little numbers. These represent priority. And it would be great if magically we could just look at this and go, yeah, centralizing is most important, least important is reducing redundancy. But the reality is it's not that easy. Even one individual person, it becomes tricky. So what we want to do is we want to break it down and prioritize each of the sections to help understand, okay, probably in this case, centralizing knowledge resources, reducing the number of enterprise systems, and making SharePoint the search gateway for the enterprise is our main goal. Right? We can start to build out our different objectives. Multiple people in the room and they can't decide on one, you get sort of drawn up into these discussions. There's other techniques like paired comparison and stuff. Again, I don't have time to get into, but really helps with that. Another step here is mapping the solutions that you're going to build to those objectives. Say we figured out our objectives. We'll use these terrible egg ones as examples. And we decided that centralizing knowledge and resources was the most important thing to our business. All I've done is I've used a simple table, sort of simple direct and indirect relationship. You can use this for anything. And what it tells me right at a glance is that, section 1, adjust site structure and taxonomy, the first line here, it is related to centralizing knowledge, resources, and those types of things. So if we're going to spend money in that, that's going to help us achieve our objective, right? It doesn't tell us how, it just tells us that there's a relationship there. What's more, what we might not want to spend money on if enhancing collaboration is important to us is for whatever reason we've decided this solution, implementing workflow, doesn't really have any anything to do with that. So what we do is there's a lot of initiatives that most people have when they think of SharePoint, especially inside your organization if you've already implemented it. And what you want to do is you look at those initiatives and really decide which ones are helping you achieve your goals. If they're helping you, then we want to put those as a lower priority unless there's some dependencies and technical things that we need to consider. So it's really important. This does two things. It communicates effectively to management and stakeholders that we plan for SharePoint. This is measuring whether or not it's successful. It also helps explain the value of SharePoint to them. If I'm talking to an executive and I say the value of SharePoint is it's going to help us achieve these objectives, these ones that you want, it makes it a very easy conversation when I start to say I need more resources to do getting dashboards for you, because that's one of the things we need to do and we need more resources for it. Why? Oh, because this, and this, but this is why it's valuable to you for it to be executed instead of being delayed. What expectation we have to set? I mentioned earlier there's a sort of expectation around SharePoint projects that executives and especially stakeholders really need to understand. That's that it takes time. SharePoint is not a quick solution. Yes, you can build rapid prototypes, but here's sort of this process flow that you have to go through when you build most solutions. I'll explain it with an example. What we have is we might have a news portal, so an intranet, if you will, where we just post news articles, so very communication-based. And the process for that is I take a news article, I write it up in Word on my desktop, I copy the Word contents, and I put it into SharePoint, upload it into a SharePoint document library. I add a link on the home page to reference that. Boom, my news story is up in SharePoint. Very basic model. I'm using the information-driven or communication capabilities of SharePoint. Now what I do is I'm going to work, because there's a lot of these news stories I need to do, I'm going to work with my buddy there, and my colleague and I are working together to build these documents. Rather than us sending emails, because it's not working, we're going to use that document library that I've already created and use version history in SharePoint and kind of go back and forth. We'll use alerting features to know when things are changing, etc. So now what we're doing is we're using collaboration-driven features, and then we're publishing it on sort of homepage. So we're doing both of these two tasks, right? Next step might be saying, okay, now what I need is our boss. We have the sneaker net. And what I mean by sneaker net is I run out of my office with this paper, put it on my boss's in-desk. He eventually gets it, eventually approves it, sends it back to me at his own disclosure. Eventually I get it, I put it on the portal, and I publish it, right? So the publishing process of getting it sort of on that home page needs that approval. And unfortunately, that's a manual, slow process right now. So I tell my boss, there's this workflow feature in SharePoint. It's pretty straightforward. I can just set up an approval for you, and you can just approve it online. And he goes, that's awesome. So what you do is you build that out, and now what's happening is we're working on it, we're getting to approve it, and then we're publishing it. So we're in these three areas of the spectrum. We're slowly working our way up. Lastly, what we might do, our boss's boss says, look, I want to know how much time and money and effort you guys are spending on building these news articles for the website. You say, well, if we were back here, if I was building it on my desktop and then I just uploaded it and then that was the published process, would I be able to give him that information? Maybe, but it would be very difficult, right? It would be very ambiguous. I would be guessing based on how long I spend on a desktop, etc. And find, even for that, there's this approval process, which is SneakerNet. So in these two instances here, it's a little bit better because I have version history, I have modified dates and things like that, but I don't have how long it takes for that approval to really work, right? Whether it was my delay or it was my boss's delay, etc. And finally, when I get to this point, not only do we have the workflow history, we'll have that version history and everything else. So at this point, I could easily look at all that data and give him the report that he wants, the dashboard or insight into that. But until I get all the way through this and to this level, I can't really give that level of detail. In the same way, you can't, have a dashboard or report on data if the data doesn't exist, right? If SharePoint or if it's in other methods, whether it's on paper-based or something like that. This is a simplified way of looking at, look, it takes time. For me to get to here, we have to kind of walk through this process. An entire portal, an entire intranet might start off as information-driven, and then maybe you create a new sort of area for people to work on to do team sites and project management. And then we get into, okay, let's automate some of these business processes. And so we have to make our way over to here. If we just jump in this side, it's more challenging. It's still possible, but very, very difficult. So hopefully this helps. When someone says, where are you on Project XYZ, you can tell them, look, we're at the collaboration stage, we're having some problems with this area. There's some user adoption issues, or there's some unexpected technical difficulties, etc. The outcome here is that with these techniques, right, the key ones being communicating, why it decreases the cost of ownership and why it's valuable to the business, we can get momentum and buy-in. But here's the thing, expectations never decrease. If you tell them, hey, it's going to do all these great things for you, and then you leave them, and you come back maybe 3 months, 1 month later, you're going to find the expectations continually increased over that period of time. It never really decreased, and that's always the same. So by communicating with them on a regular basis, we're able to manage those expectations. We're able to say, look, a solution XYZ is more complicated than we initially thought, or this process of going from communication all the way to, sort of this business intelligence-driven thing, it's taking us longer than we expected due to this and that. But you're clearly communicating it in a way that anyone can understand without understanding the technology underpinnings. So one of the fun areas is ROI with SharePoint, right? How do we get to this happy place where we're like, SharePoint is helping our business and we're proving it, right? Very, very difficult thing to do. And I'm going to start off by describing 3 ways that you can do it from just like a calculation or a method perspective. You could use a thing called discounted cash flow. So what we could do is, and the real key here is that payback is over a period of time, right? It's not right away. At some point in time, after we've accrued a lot of costs, we're going to start getting the value return, and it's going to start compensating. Anyway, this is a really mean thing to kind of play at in the afternoon. We don't want to watch that, so let's move on to the next one. Real options analysis, another way of calculating it. What we're doing is, the faster we fail, the better it is, right? We look at it, we go, if I fail quickly, it's going to cost me less. If I move through these phases, I can quickly see that the cost is growing. But it also helps me decide whether or not I want to continue, whether we want to hold off continuing because it's going to be very costly, and so on and so forth. So this is a good way of doing it since SharePoint implementations are iterative. This is really boring. Let's move on. Evaluating with Monte Carlo analysis is my favorite way. It's probably, anyways, this is boring, right? You guys are like, oh, okay, I'm thinking about exiting this webinar. So let's make it more fun, right? Let's talk about the interesting stuff. So it's the same, there's different ways of calculating ROI because you can look that up on Google or you can ask a finance person. There's only 2 ways of using return on investment in SharePoint. Prioritization and to improve the return or investment that we make. So this one is the simplest formula ever. It's something even Joe can do. It's estimated value divided by estimated difficulty. And you probably do this on a regular basis, but do you document it? Maybe not. So what I'm encouraging is if you've never really done ROI analysis, start off with this simple formula. Say, okay, I've got a difficult requirement and I've got an easy requirement. Map it out somewhere out of 10, 8, guesstimate it, and then say, okay, the value of this, the value to the business or to me or whoever the stakeholder is, maybe 4 out of 10 or 6 out of 10. And what we do is when we do that simple formula, we can quickly and easily see that, the easier requirement is the one we should do first, right? If there's technical dependencies, fine. But the reality is, what are the things that we want to do first, the ones that have the best return? So this helps you decide what to do, right? In SharePoint, there's always a million things that we could do. Ones should we do first and why? It's also useful because if you just do this simply, you're going to get better and better at calibrating your estimates. What I mean by that is if you do this and say, oh, I messed up on estimated difficulty, you might realize the next time you do it that, it's going to be a little bit more or a little bit less than you expected. So measuring in the first place is useful, but this is a great way to start off. And here, a more important part, instead of prioritizing, is improving return on investment, right? ROI traditionally measures the financial impact, but it misses these other things, right? The number of visitors, increased connections, skills, right? Improved know-how, like, I know how to do this now, reputation, comments, click-throughs. This is stuff that we typically might use SharePoint when we start to convince management, everyone's using it, right? We look at just the usage statistics and everyone's using it. But is that really ROI? How do we translate that, right? How do we explain to management that this is why it's valuable, to measure this, and B, what they want to know about this information? So, still important. Let's talk about that. So, a previous example we had was this news site, right? An intranet where we published news articles. So, what happens is we decide to talk to management and we say, wouldn't it be useful to you if you could sort of put your thoughts out there, if you could communicate to the organization, not in just a formal news article, but when you deal with merger and acquisition stuff or problems in the economy or new plans that you want to do, whatever happens to be, things that leadership needs to communicate with, and maybe they do it with newsletters and other things right now. Decide we're going to use the blog engine in SharePoint for that, and we say you guys can start blogging. Maybe we don't use the term blogging. Maybe we just tell them articles, whatever. But that's the process. We create these blogs, and we say the value of this is going to be worth something to them. Eventually figure out, and obviously this is a little bit more complicated process, but it's actually fairly easy in the long run. You look at it, how much are they spending on all these other initiatives like news articles and newsletters and stuff like that in order to communicate with their own employees, and how much can we save by doing this blog format as an example. And what that might do is it might have benefits of commenting, engagement, etc. Right? Those are all benefits that we can derive. So we decide to them that the value of that, each time they can reach an audience of 400 people, it's worth $5,000 for them. And yes, there is a way we can do that where they agree that that's how valuable it is to them. What they do is we measure it, and we find immediately that they're not getting any hits. So we're really worried, right? Our investment to build this blog platform, the fact that they're adding articles every couple of days or whatever, is actually not having any impact. And there's one spike in one of those people. We look at metrics and we see that very high on this one. So we say, well, what happened? So we call them up. We say, what did you do? And he emailed everyone. So you find out that the issue is there was awareness, right? People aren't aware that these blogs are happening. So measuring it in the first place, we're aware that it's not being seen by enough people when it comes out. It's maybe a new feature and they weren't aware of it, or it's buried inside navigation or something. So what we do is we change that, put a content query web part on the homepage, and when we do that, we immediately see this news articles are rolling up on the homepage. People are clicking through, and we're getting the hits that we wanted. 5,000, 5,000, 5,000, right? We're starting to get the return on investment of whatever amount of time it took us to implement this and have the executive team blog. The next step is we actually use that for even more. We may find that on some months or some dates, the news article that they put or this blog post is more valuable. More people were interested in it, or more people came back to it, right? Which infers that maybe this was a better topic to talk about. So what this gives is the executive knowledge that he didn't have before, right? A very valuable knowledge, how to better his communication, how to talk about what really matters to the organization, and to find out what matters to the organization. All of this stuff is possible because we were measuring it in the first place, and then because we're taking steps throughout the process to improve based on those measurements, right? So we're doing ROI and the measurement and all these other calculations to help us improve return on investment. And that's really what ROI is all about. If I spend $10,000 making $1 equal $1, that's not really valuable, right? Microsoft is awesome. If you're interested in more ROI type stuff, the SharePoint Deployment Planning Services has a wonderful business, creates a little business case and business model. So this is a free service that's offered by Microsoft. If you have certain vouchers under your agreement, so you have like a good support agreement, you can basically get these vouchers and then hire a company like our company, come in, do the free engagements for 1 to 15 days depending on it, and we have deliverables we must execute. Structured, and it's very useful because it forces us to build a business case in almost every one of those deliverables. So that's going to obviously have some of this ROI stuff. That economic justification guide is also a great resource. If you haven't read it, give it a read. Again, it's a little bit heavy, so have a couple copies, but certainly it's worth taking a quick read at. So I want to talk about a quick story. At the end of World War II, there were Spitfires, and what would happen is someone would land, and when they would land on the tarmac, these engineers would come out onto the field, and they would basically put these big weeds across them, and they would take charcoal and run across rigorously on the sheets. And what they'd find is that there were bullet holes in specific places, right? This was creating a set, if you will, of all the bullet holes. They'd take these back to their offices, put them on a big lamp all over top of each other, and they'd see patterns, right? Very key, very easy. They'd see patterns of where a plane got shot. And they discovered that certain areas of the plane got shot more than others. What they did is they decided to armor those areas of the plane, right? Makes sense. These areas of the plane get shot more. Let's armor those areas. So they armored those areas of the plane. They sent them out. This costs more money, right, because they've added armor. They sent them out, and then unfortunately they did worse, right? They did almost the same or not worse. So they were expecting this benefit where less would be shot down, and it didn't happen. Can you get that? The was actually that they were measuring the wrong thing. They were measuring the planes that came back, right? The ones that landed on the tarmac. The ones that got shot down, they never measured in the first place. So really the thing they should have been measuring where the plane got shot down, and specifically when you think about where those bullet holes were, the ones, the patterns that they saw where it got shot more, those were the least vital areas of the plane. So they actually should have armored the opposite areas. And this is based on a true story. So this is, an extreme example of measuring the wrong thing, but it happens in organizations. In one organization I worked with, perspective, and had a lot of metrics. They had over 60 metrics that they were using, and that includes a bunch of different measurements, right, for each project. So each has all this stuff that they measure. And I eventually found out, because I just can't let it sit, I have to figure out everything. I walked my way through the organization, talked to everyone, and I eventually found that only 6 of those metrics were really used. Of all metrics, throughout the whole process, only 6 were used. The rest of them were just kind of funneled up and eventually kind of discarded throughout the process. And what we decided was, really, we should be using 12, which was useful for them, but we need to measure a lot of these other things. And so what we did is we removed a lot of those other measurements and then saved the organization more money than probably the SharePoint implementation did by reducing all this extraneous work and effort. So, measuring is important, but, only measure what seems to be adding value. If it doesn't seem to be adding value, assess it and decide whether or not it's really worth mitigating risk or something else. So it's measuring effort effectively to better prioritize and improve, right? Those reasons that you measure. And bad estimation or measurement is a lot of the reasons that people don't estimate. And this is a terrible thing because even like a vague answer, like a guess, is better than nothing because it gives you a baseline or something to work with, right? And you're going to get better and better at it than nothing. Complete uncertainty is far worse. So if you've never done a lot of estimates for SharePoint, if you've always kind of just been like, well, we'll just do it and then see how it pans out, start doing this more often so you can start to get a better feeling for how much knowledge you have of SharePoint projects and really the challenges and pain points that you're running into. Implementing successful governance is going to be the fastest governance talk of all time. With governance, lots of different interpretations. It's required, right? Why is it required? With effective governance, organization performance and capability are significantly reduced. What it really mean, right? It means without governance, it's like a football team with a team structure, without roles on the team, where the B sometimes plays, the front, the back or something like that, right? So the roles are all mixed up. It's sort of hassle. Can that team perform effectively? No way, right? They're not structured. They don't have good patterns and practices and so on and so forth. What we want with governance is we really want, at the end of the day, instead of focusing on the documents and deliverables, we really want is good teamwork. And I know it seems cheesy, but that's really the point of governance on any SharePoint projects anyways. So one way of breaking this down briefly is you'd have 5 teams, a business strategy team who's going to do that prioritization and objective mapping stuff that I talked about earlier, the technical strategy team who's going to say this is what we're going to use, this is how we're going to build the solution to meet that objective, right? So if you think about it, the business strategy is creating the objectives, the technical initiative strategy is saying this is how we meet those objectives, and the tactical teams execute that work or support the different systems, right? And so hopefully the tactical teams make sense here. Operations deals with the service and all those types of concerns. Development deals with demand. And finally, support is going to be dealing with training and all sorts of other rollouts and issues around SharePoint. And so development here that eventually grows and eventually gets into SharePoint Designer and stuff like that too. But specifically those tactical teams, what's really key is that they have patterns and they plan for them and they execute on them, right? And what I mean by that is it's kind of like this football example I'll bring it back to. What we do is we look at their problems and we say, okay, we keep into the same problems in SharePoint. When we do deal with site request, it takes us a long time. We start running over each other's toes. So what we're going to do is when a site request comes in, our business analyst, Joe, is going to take it. Business analyst, Joe, takes it, looks at it, assesses it with the other person, passes it to the infrastructure guy. The infrastructure goes in and he looks at it and he says, okay, this is the capacity requirements, etc. Passes it back to Joe. Joe passes it to the development guys to build maybe some add-ons or customize some columns, whatever it happens to be in SharePoint Designer or in Visual Studio. And then he passes it back and Joe says, okay, here's your site, right? But what's happened there is we have a clear plan or play for each of those processes that come in. And those plays, if you will, that pattern that you find is probably the most valuable addition of all of this. Obviously, defining objectives and all that is very important as well, but being able to execute that effectively is what starts to decrease the amount of money that you're spending on supporting SharePoint and, running into issues where you can't support it effectively because you can't respond because your team's very unstructured. I'm just going to give a quick example of a client once told us, I loved it. They like the football example, but they like the sort of soccer or European football example, where basically it's like mob ball when you watch little kids play. So if you have nieces, nephews, or children, and you watch them play on a field, they run around, and it literally is like this packed mob of people running around after the ball. And they have a chance or opportunity to kick the ball, they kick it. They don't care where it goes, right? And some organizations, unfortunately, their SharePoint teams are kind of like that. They run around, and then they kick the ball or take the chance on SharePoint the second that they have the opportunity. So this is important to avoid and create that structure. So what do most people focus on? The governance documents, right? The governance plan, those types of things. There's a lot there. It's going to define what SharePoint will be, what SharePoint won't be, right? It's going to help us define a bunch of operational stuff, like, hey, this is how we're going to deal with monitoring, this is how we're going to deal with backup and recovery and disaster recovery, etc. Again, I'm skipping through this because it's really not that important for what I'm trying to get across. You can find all this information online. And then support, I'll just go back for a second. Support, right, all the typical stuff, user expectations, training, all those things. Development has a bunch of stuff, and there's obviously a lot more than what I'm going into here, but to give you a bit of context that these groups are building all these documents through their work on a regular basis, right? They're finding these patterns and practices, discovering that a deliverable or a document is necessary in order to improve that, and then they create the document. Microsoft is awesome. They have this governance checklist. This is old. It's from 2007. Still love it because you don't use it. You don't want to go through it and check everything off. But read it, it might be things you've never considered before, right? So it's useful to read over and go, oh, I never thought about that for SharePoint. Oh, I never thought about creating a sitemap. Or I never thought about doing content types and things like that. So very useful to read over. Of course, the community has a ton of governance resources. This is one of the topics. You do a Google search, you'll find a million different results with different perspectives. So I'll let you do that on your own time. So with governance, what do we get? Effective team. Achieves a shared understanding of SharePoint-related processes, right? So what I really mean by this, it's really focus on SharePoint-related processes. You can't boil the ocean. Yes, you might use what you do in SharePoint governance and go, oh, that worked really well. Let's use it in other technologies or for other areas of the business. But you really want to start with a focused SharePoint rather than all these other things, because that will back to you and it'll make it harder for you to just kind of focus and narrow down and clean up your SharePoint issues. And just documents, I've kind of talked about this enough. Okay. And supporting SharePoint. What is the approach for SharePoint implementations? Right? What I mean by that is it's a very large platform, so we have to work our way through it, right? Rapid proof of concepts and things like that is exactly what SharePoint is good for. Whatever you do, don't take the old-fashioned waterfall approach and try and build everything perfect at the gate and have a year-long project. It's just a terrible idea with a platform like SharePoint. Instead, do proof of concept. If you're doing integration work, make some fake data, bring it in, and show them what it will look like in SharePoint. This is how it looks like in an external list in SharePoint 2010. This is how it looks like in search results and so on and so forth. This is what we want to do because it helps create a better picture. We get better requirements and so on and so forth. Communication planning is key, right? In fact, if you think about it, communication is the root of all technology. Why use technology X, Y, and Z? Because it helps me better enable communication. And what do I mean by that? Think of Outlook, Word, SharePoint, car helps you get to a person so you can talk to them more, phone, everything that I can think of anyways personally about technology, it helps with communication. So on the earth, don't people create communication plans? Further on right now, if you haven't created a communication plan for your SharePoint project, please do one. It doesn't take much effort. And what it does is it helps you identify how you're going to deal with outages. It helps you identify who you need to communicate, projects to, updates if projects are doing poorly or they need to be rearranged or reprioritized or delayed and so on and so forth. All these types of things should be clearly indicated in this communication plan so you know how you're going to communicate to the rest of the business or specifically to the management team or teams with SharePoint so that they know what's going on. This is a big challenge with SharePoint. Right? A big thing that a lot of people do, especially if you're that one man in your organization or woman who's dealing with all these different SharePoint issues. You're sort of the dev, you're the admin, you're the business analyst, you're doing all these things, then you're not Superman. So don't forget that. So instead of trying to deal with it all on your own, leverage what you have, right? Leverage the people in your organization. So use those end users that are a bit more savvy. You can call them super users, you can call them whatever you want, but make sure you leverage them, right? Teach them the skills that they need, and then rely on them. Give them expectations. Say, look, I need you to take over this and be responsible for this, this, and this, your content in your site, keeping it updated, making sure that there's not copies of it in other places, and so on and so forth. And in return, I'm going to give you a higher level of escalation or support. So when you have a support issue, I'll respond to you faster than I'll respond to everyone else who's not a site administrator or not a super user, etc. So it's a cool model that helps you build out a team. And even as that one person, you can still build that team to help support you. And you need to if you are being successful with SharePoint, because you know everything. Measuring is really important. I'm going to describe one more quick story. When I was working with one company, we just finished a couple governance sessions, and I came out and we were just kind of walking and talking in the hall. And as we walked past the help desk, overheard this conversation, and I'm bad at eavesdropping while I'm having other conversations. And in the background, I heard them basically describing this problem, which was they get extra login prompting in SharePoint, and that happens fairly regularly. And what it was is they hadn't set this little IE setting, Internet Explorer setting, that says, set either a trusted site or in a trusted intranet zone, or basically remember my username and password. And so it was the fix for it. But what they actually said, which floored me, was you reformat your computer. And so I stopped, obviously, and we investigated it and figured it out. And obviously the solution that was correct was the one suggesting, but the reality is that reformatting the computer would have actually solved the problem, because this specific employee hadn't been back to the office in a long time, so they didn't get the AD updates and so on and so forth. So what happened is if they had reformatted, they would have brought it back to IT. IT would have done their updates, etc., and then obviously the group policies would be applied, and then it would have the appropriate IE settings. So what would have happened in this person's mind, in this help desk person's mind, is they would have actually expected that that was the solution for SharePoint. So earlier I mentioned, help desk is important. Make sure you train them, right? Make sure they understand how SharePoint works. Importantly, they understand how to categorize SharePoint issues. Because if you put everything as SharePoint, instead of saying SharePoint permissions issue, SharePoint document management issue, or whatever, and you break it down into proper categories, what will happening is, let's see, you decide. You've seen personally a lot of SharePoint permission issues. So you kind of push and push and eventually get them to roll out SharePoint permissions training. And so you call your site administrators to give them permissions training. Then what ends up happening is you find that there's a huge influx or a larger number of support issues that are coming in for SharePoint. What does that tell you? Nothing, except that that training probably didn't work. It was not measured appropriately. But if we measured it and we said, well, we had 20 permission issues a month before, now we have 5, and now we have all these other ones, that means that it's actually not permissions. The permissions training worked well, and what we're getting is more adoption, more people using it, not being limited by maybe what permissions was. So measuring support and classifying it appropriately is really important as well. Diversifying it, everyone kind of gets this, right? People learn differently. You have digestible training sessions. This, what I'm right now to you, doesn't work well, so make sure you do workshops and things like that. It's learning to drive. It's the first time I learned to drive stick shift with my dad. He's a very large, scary man, and my face was very frightened. And that same facial expression, instead of holding a stick, they're holding the mouse on their keyboard and looking at SharePoint. So keep in mind, for some people, it's a lot to take in and deal with. Microsoft is awesome. Does anyone see a recurring theme here? Productivity Hub is great. It's a little tool. It's a site collection, if you will, and you can implement it very easily. There's very low risk. It allows you to basically have a complete collection of content and help materials that Microsoft releases on a quarterly basis for updates, as well as add your own, so you could add BlackBerry or something to this. It also allows you to do the code part, right, and you have a sort of place to start working on that and creating a community internally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even if you're not going to roll this out as, okay, self-help, et cetera, you do your self-help, you might use it just for your training team or just for your support team as a resource to go and look up stuff when they get questions and need to respond to things. So please look at Productivity Hub for SharePoint. It's free, it's awesome, it's great for Microsoft. So tip, respond. The worst SharePoint support you can get is we're not responding to users when they come to you for questions and issues, because that says two things. It says this isn't important, and it also obviously makes IT and whoever is running it look bad. So you need to make sure you're responding to it, just like it's a 911 call. Maybe you can't solve it right then, but if you get that governance stuff down right and you're able to execute well, you're certainly able to respond within a very short amount of time to each of the issues. Support it effectively if we're able to do all that. And the training and support can be very costly. Most people don't think of that, right? They look at it and go, oh, SharePoint and training and stuff we'll deal with later. Make sure you put a lot of money and time and effort estimating how much that's going to cost when you implement a SharePoint platform. If you already have a SharePoint platform, you still want to do this. Like, it's never too late. Look at how much time you're currently spending, really assess and see if there's ways that you can improve that. Through some of the things I talked about. User adoption, this is an easier one to zip through. How to get successful user adoption? Users understand value. What does that really mean? Well, here's Joe. He's got this box. He doesn't know what the box is, but he's happy with it. He understands how to use it, right? That's the sort of transformation we want to make. So what we really need them is we give them SharePoint. They don't really get it. We need them to understand the value that it presents. So we do a video like this one. I'll some volume for a second. So what we're showing is we're looking at a SharePoint implementation, and we're looking at all these different parts of the SharePoint implementation. And specifically, not only it doesn't need to be 3D, by the way. It can just be a quick screen capture program. But what we're seeing is how you use it, what it's giving to me, right? This is something that's so easy for you to create, right? So why doesn't every organization do this? Because they don't plan for it, right? Remember, plan for that training and stuff. If you plan for this, this is definitely something you should have in every single rollout of an intranet or anything like that in your organization, and applications that are big enough in scope. Availability, mobility, accessibility also leads to better adoption. What do I mean by that? If the servers go down, obviously that's not going to be great for adoption. If people can access it externally, right, outside of the organization's walls, that's going to be helpful. So if you get it through the firewalls. Obviously, if they can access it on mobile devices, that's going to help, especially nowadays. And accessibility, I mean actually, visually impaired people and those types of things. Believe it or not, but that also can help with user adoption. SharePoint has really tiny fonts. It's really kind of annoying. So if you're, you want to do something simple, just add a little widget that changes all the font sizes and things like that. Ta-da! All of a sudden, SharePoint's a little bit more user-friendly and that sort of thing for certain types of users. Obviously, taking it offline, that's what I mentioned at the bottom there, very important and useful to get a better option. I lumped that all together because most of those are hopefully obvious, but I just wanted to highlight them. Cultivate and promote culture, super key, right? If you have a culture that whispers, etc., it's not going to work. Create identity and brand. SharePoint 2007 branding sucks, right? So what we're going to do is make it look better and make it more usable. Or in 2010, at least do these things. Consistency across the environment. If you start to use different themes and other colors, it creates confusion for the end user. In the same way you say, hey, I want to customize my Outlook so it looks differently, we don't allow, right, as a policy, we don't say, okay, you can customize where this is in Outlook and so on and so forth. We have a consistent layout, right, that we want to use for Outlook, and that's how it's built into the product. And the same that we want to have a consistent layout for SharePoint when I go from site to site so that I know where I am and where to find things. Modify these templates. The welcome, edit content right on the page should never be in any of your sites, right? If you see that, then obviously you're not taking any time and energy thinking about usability and brand because you haven't actually customized any of the pages or made it easier for the user to understand how to use them. Some of those are board ready, right? So if you want it, focus on them. Don't focus on the people who don't. It's harder. This is great for attention grabbing, not great for user adoption, right? So for, hey, this is interesting, but not so great if you want to follow up and so on and so forth and really build, dependency on the platform. Use Love, again, I mentioned this, use Outlook, etc. There's a lot of integration touch points there that you want to focus on. Say a user comes up to you and they say, I built this thing in SharePoint, and your first reaction is, oh God, what is that? Why did you build it that way? That's not a good reaction, right? And to say that when people view access applications, go, oh God, why did you, right? What we want to do is we want to respond with, that's a great idea. I like what you're doing here. How can we make it better, right? It's a simple personality switch or whatever, but as an organization, you really want to encourage that because you really do want people to be proud of the things that they're building in SharePoint since that's the real purpose of it. Reward people, give them, create certification paths internally, award programs, all sorts of things like that. Create a showcase. So if someone does something really cool, they use SharePoint for vacation tracking or something like that. Let's use that as a showcase. Take some screenshots, describe what it is, and then someone else use that afterwards. Look at it and go, oh, I can build off of that. Maybe they do some color coding or something. Add that on to the SharePoint Showcase. Now you have two different ways of managing, say, vacation scheduling. One guy uses Outlook, another guy uses SharePoint lists, right? And that kind of creates this sort of almost like shopping area that people in the organization can go and look at and go, oh, that's cool. I bet you that would help me. And there's no cost to the organization except for just implementing these little quick solutions instead of having to buy another product and support another product and all those other issues. Cake mix, that's weird. So 1950s, instinct mix came out, the greatest idea ever scientifically. It allows you to make cake just by adding water, put it in, boom, you have cake. Unfortunately, it sold really poorly. So Betty Crocker said, what's going on? They brought a lot of people in a room, a lot of housewives and things like that, and they said, why? What is it that you don't like about our cake mix? And they said, well, we don't feel like we're part of the process. We like cooking, we like baking, we like being involved in it. And so I said, well, how do we, what do you mean? And they said, well, they really like to be involved. So what Crocker did was they took the egg and they took it out of the cake mix. So you have to add eggs in. And that made everyone feel like they're involved in the process. And a great result of that is that it sold like hotcakes, pun intended. And so everyone loves Betty Crocker and this. And to this day, it still has the egg out of it, not because scientifically they need to, but simply because it sells better when there's involvement of maybe your kids or yourself. Me, I'm a terrible cook, so I have to do it. So when I do it, adding that egg is a challenge for me, and I feel so satisfied when I've properly added the egg without the eggshells in my cake, right? So the same way, same idea. What does that mean for SharePoint? It means involve your users. Make them feel like they're part of the process, because if you don't, then again, it's not going to sell, right? It's not going to be adopted. SharePoint is successfully adopted by a large enough number, right? I'm saying everyone. You'll never get everyone. You want to get the large number of people that you want. So if you're targeting a department, fine. You need to have a certain number of people in that department. If you're looking at the enterprise, maybe it's 20%, or maybe it's 300 people, or maybe it's like these key people need to adopt it. If they adopt it, we're probably good, right? You have to define what your adoption criteria is. And and you get them to just come, it's not going to work. So nice and easy to wrap this up. Plan work and growth. What we're saying is know your limits. All this we've talked about, all these cool things we could do with it. We talked about objectives and neat things that we're going to use the SharePoint platform for and why it's valuable and being able to explain it, but we never really talked about how do we know when we're at our limit, right? How do we know when we need to hire new staff? So what you want to do is you always look at that, come back to that objectives, right? And the objective matrix I did, that tells us who we need on which projects, because this project needs to be executed in order to meet this objective, right? So if that project needs extra developers, if it needs extra administrators, then we need that in order to deal with the challenges that we currently have. And it's not just hiring developers and administrators. It might be hiring project managers. It might be hiring super users or site administrators, like people that their only job is really, content coordination or content management, things like that. That actually is an existing role in a lot of enterprises right now, and it's growing. You might have trainers. You get it. There's a lot of different roles beyond even what I have listed here that you need to build out in your teams. You need to define carefully, because let's face it, finding SharePoint talent today is very, very difficult. And finding a person who can do all of these things, extraordinarily difficult. And if you do find them, please let me know, because I will hire them for more than whatever you're paying them. So with that in mind, cultivating new work, it's a great thing. It's the best to get user adoption, and it's the best way to tell if SharePoint's successful, because hey, if it's growing, if it's expanding, then that's the best way to see whether or not you're being successful. And the last one, if you don't plan for that channel of new work and how you're going to deal with it, prioritizing it and executing it, people are going to lose confidence that SharePoint is an important part of your platform and your enterprise. So being successful requires understanding the non-technical as well as the technical. Success factors are understanding why you make a decision is really on the business needs and mapping to them. And achieving and setting expectations is about sharing the alignment, right, in business alignment, vision, and expectations, right, saying this is what SharePoint is for us. Discern supporting ROI is really at its core about improving return, right? That's the most important thing we're doing with that. Implementing successful governance is all about teamwork and executing with patterns. Approach supporting SharePoint is being leveraging everyone and responding. Improving user adoption is just sharing those values and successes. It'll do its own thing if you can just do that effectively. And planning for new work and growth is really about managing your capabilities and priorities. So thank you everyone for your time. At this point, I'm going to look at the questions and I'll start to answer some of them. I apologize because I'm at 3:01, so I went a little bit over. But if you'd like to stay on, I will answer some of the questions that might have come in. So would you recommend for someone starting out on SharePoint? So that was one of the questions that was asked. And I think that the first answer that I would give for that type of question is that it really depends on what your needs are. So if you're sort of getting started on SharePoint and you're a developer, there's a lot of good development books from Microsoft. Press is probably, personally, I like them. They're not as well written, so if you're looking for something that's a little bit smoother to read, they're almost like the TechNet MSDN documentation with like little descriptions. So Microsoft Press has a bunch of books. If you're looking for like just do a Google search, for a lot of SharePoint books. In my personal interest, I like the Microsoft Press ones. In terms of if you're an administrator, then definitely the Microsoft Press ones, because it gives, these are like, if I remember correctly, I think Bill did one, etc. Bill English did the main administrator's companion, and that book's useful because it's built off of a Microsoft TechNet documentation as well as a specific experience with the product and interviews and stuff like that. So do it based off the best practices of Microsoft typically first, and then if you've already got that part down, start to explore the specialized books that are written by lots of people. Wendy's got a great book about branding, Driscoll, etc. So I'm probably poor answering this question, but there's a lot of really good books out there for those purposes. If you're looking for books like what I just described, talk about governance and things like that, the best books are those SharePoint Essentials books. They're Sue Hanley and Scott Jameson as the primary writers on those, and there's two of them. There's one for 2007 and there's one for 2010. 2010 one even has a free chapter online. Look up governance, you'll find SharePoint 2010 governance. One of the white papers is basically a chapter excerpt from that book all on governance. So if you like the way that that's written and you see a lot of value in it, then I would advise buying that book. Or if you like what I talked about today, it's probably the only book out there really for SharePoint that talks about those types of issues. Looks like all the questions I have right now. So, to get a copy of the presentation, absolutely. So if you're interested in getting a copy, just email me directly, or we'll have a follow-up. So a little quick comment or question, and we'll make sure you get a copy of the presentation as well as maybe in a collateral that might make sense for that. Certainly. And also, if you have questions beyond today, because there are no more questions it seems right now, if you have questions beyond today and you want to ask those, please feel free to reach out to me at any point in time. I like answering questions, so feel free to say, hey, how do I do this or how do I do that, and we'll get back to you right away. And have a great day.